So we have to have humility. Whatever identity we have is not who we are, because underneath we're fallible, mortal human beings. And we may need to change our robes for a different set of robes.
Welcome to The Race to Social Justice, a podcast that explores the myriad racial and social challenges facing the modern world, with your hosts, Kiva White and John Kepner. Thank you for being part of the courageous conversation, because when it comes to combating social injustices in America, it is not about being confrontational. It is about being conversational.
Hello, Kiva.
Hey, hello, John. Good to see you, sir. And welcome everyone to another episode of our Race to Social Justice podcast series. I am Kiva White, the black guy.
And I am John Kepner. I'm the white guy. And Kiva and I share a love of the letter K. K for Kiva, K for Kepner, and K for knowledge, what we try to impart to our listeners in these podcasts. Something that Kiva calls the K factor. Kiva, before you introduce our guest, I'd like to just remind our listeners of what our goal here is. Our goal is to promote racial and social justice and equity through honest and sometimes even difficult dialogue, what we call courageous conversations. A number of discussions over an extended period of time about racism, and it's deepened our understandings and our understanding of our personal responsibility in that regard. And this led us sort of naturally, organically to start these podcasts to discuss our guests' experiences and learn from them. And we hope that these conversations will help our audience in their journeys and maybe even our guests. So Kiva, who's our guest today?
Yes, John, I have the pleasure of introducing to our listeners and our viewers today, author David Mura. He is the author of the book, The Stories Whiteness Tells Itself. And David is an essayist. He's a memoirist. He's a poet and fiction writer who brings a really unique perspective to our multiracial and multicultural society. He's a third-generation Japanese American, has written intimately about his life as a man of color and the connections between race, culture, and history. In public appearances, he has interwoven poetry, performance, and personal testaments around his powerful insights into the racial issues facing America today. Mr. Mura's memoirs, poems, and essays, plays, and performances have won wide critical praise and numerous awards nationwide and around the globe. Their topics range from contemporary Japan to legacy of the internment camps in the history of Japanese Americans to critical explorations of an increasingly diverse America. He gives presentations at educational institutions, businesses, and other organizations throughout the country. I have read his book. I started diving into it, and I can tell you it's an eye-opener for me. I really love the subtitle, Racial Myths in Our American Narratives. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Mr. David Mura to the show. Welcome, David.
Thank you for having me.
David, I'm really eager to jump into your book, but we like to ask our guests when we start out about their origin stories. Mm-hmm. And you have a particularly interesting one, and it's profiled in the introduction to the book. But could you talk about your origin story and how? Because what we often find is that story lays a foundation for the work or the commitment of our guests to racial and social justice. So let's start there.
Well, my paternal grandfather came here from Japan in 1898. So my family has been here for a century and a quarter. My parents and their families during World War II were imprisoned by the United States government because all 120,000 of Japanese Americans who were living on the West Coast were taken from their homes, put behind barbed wire fences in prisons with rifle towers with guards, with the guns pointed inwards. And they were held in desolate areas throughout the American West and South. And the way I talk about this experience for my parents and their families is that they were imprisoned for their race and ethnicity. Because obviously, for instance, my parents were 11, 15, they had done nothing wrong. No Japanese American was ever convicted of espionage. And they didn't do the same thing to Italian or German Americans, who were also, and Italy and Germany were our enemies during World War II. So my parents, I think, took in this message, both consciously and unconsciously, that it was their race and ethnicity, which was their crime. And so if you shoplift and you get out of prison to show you're reformed, you don't shoplift anymore. So what happens if you're in prison because of your race and ethnicity? And my father was told by one of his white teachers in the camps, when you get out of here, you should try to be not 100% American, but 200% American. And my father understood this to mean that he should assimilate into a white middle-class identity. And so I was raised in a way to sort of think of myself just like white people. And I went to an all-Jewish suburb in Chicago. We lived there. I went to school actually with Merrick Garland. And when a white friend would say to me, I think of you, David, just like a white person, I would go, great, that's how I want to be thought. And I went to English graduate school and read through all of the Anglo-American canon, but I read no Black authors. And then late in my 20s, I started reading Black authors. And I realized there was this whole language for talking about race that I had never been exposed to. And it came to me that I was not white. I was never going to be white. And I better begin to figure out what it means to be a Japanese American. And since my parents had never talked about their history of their imprisonment, I had to go back and do research. I had to think about the implications of this, not just the historical implications or legal implications of their imprisonment, but how it affected their psychology, the way they thought about their identity. And so I think a couple of things came out of all of that. Is one, I understood that the history of race in America is very complicated, and it affects all our racial identities. And that my whole life in a way as an author has been a search for a language to talk about the complexities of race, to talk about the complexities of racial identity, and to talk about those things, not just in isolation, but in terms of learning about African Americans, learning about Asian Americans, learning about Latino Americans, Indigenous Americans, Arab Americans. And so this book, in many ways, is a culmination of many years of thinking and studying race in America.
Wow, so many things pop up in my mind as you share a part of your story, and thank you for doing that. This whole concept, particularly in the African American community, of passing for white, or white passing, a light-skinned person who, skin-wise, they may be able to assimilate and pass for white. Just using your words, David, they could never be white, particularly if they have African American families or parents. And then the other thought that I had was around, sometimes you hear, an African American kid who speaks, well and articulate, and how that is kind of somewhat shunned upon in the Black community by others that say, "What you speak white, or you're talking white." And so this assimilation that you mentioned, it seems like it prevails in so many different cultures to get folks who are not of white skin to assimilate to the culture of white America. Mm-hmm. And I know for me, unfortunately, I'm dark as dark chocolate, so I could never assimilate to whiteness because of my skin color. And so I appreciate you sharing how it was kind of like this consciousness raising, and you use the word consciousness a lot in your book about raising of consciousness of who we are, in terms of our own race and our own ethnic background, and hold true and dear to that. And I guess the dichotomous nature between what white America says and what Black and African American experiences have been is where some of the dividing lines continue to exist in this country. And I wanted to just ask you, how has your identity as a third generation Japanese American really informed your writing? I know you shared a little bit about your parents' history, but how has your personal identity informed your thinking and the thoughts that generated you writing this book?
Well, I think one of the ways that my experience has been shaped is that I'm an artist, I'm a writer. And I have been in many different organizations and also here in the Twin Cities where artists and writers of color get together. And we produce work together, we teach together. And in certain ways, it's much easier for artists from different communities to get together, to have dialogue, to really talk intimately about because that's what we do when we write. We write intimately about our lives, and we share, deep traumas, deep truths about our lives. And in the early 90s, with my friend Alex Pate, who's an African-American novelist and educator, and whom I actually write about in the book, we saw what was happening after the Rodney King decision in LA. And we saw Asian Americans and African Americans in conflict. The Korean Americans and African Americans were in conflict there. And we just thought, well, if we just get up on stage together and begin saying, like, I'm Asian American, he's African American, we're friends, we're offering a different model. And so we created a show based on the events, the Rodney King video, which was really, in many ways, one of the first significant capturing in video of police brutality. And for years, obviously, African Americans have been telling about police brutality, about police murder, about police harassment. And white people have either ignored it or said, we don't believe you, right? And then finally, with the Rodney King decision, there was this video showing everybody what had happened. And yet the four policemen were, the policemen were acquitted. But that was the beginning, I think, way back in the early 90s, of my beginning to think about the experience of African Americans when dealing with police. And I remember just sitting around a table with several African American men who were, we were all artists, directors, actors, writers. And it was me and about 7 Black men. And they all began talking about their experiences driving while Black. And I had the sense that probably if I'd been a white guy, they probably wouldn't have been as honest talking about their experiences, because in certain ways they told these stories which they were laughing at because the absurdity of the injustice was so obvious. And it was a way of their dealing with their pain. But I think they understood that I didn't take the jokes as this is a laughing matter. This is a way that we survive and deal with difficult trauma. And so I had the experience. My friend Alex is a leading educator, and he's created this program called The Innocent Classroom, which is designed to train teachers to improve the relationships with students of color. Another friend of mine, Frank Wilderson, is one of the leading theorists of Afro-pessimism, the academic school of thought. So I've learned so much from, my fellow artist friends of all different races.
I want to ask you about the title of the book, but first I want to pick up on your friend, Alec, because the first chapter so for our listeners, this book is a series of essays that David has written, and it has a wide variety of subjects with a common theme. But the first chapter that I read was the one about the movie Armistead, and I wonder if you could talk about that and the contrast between Spielberg's approach to that story and then your friend's approach to making a novel out of that story. That might give our readers, our listeners, hopefully your future readers, an idea of what this book is really like.
Yes. So, my book, The Stories Whiteness Tells Itself, is about the way we narrate our history and our present. And so it's the way we narrate past history, but it's also about fictional narratives. And so the movie Amistad was a movie directed and commissioned by film director Steven Spielberg, who has adopted Black children, is a white liberal, I believes in racial progress, I'm absolutely certain. And it's about, the movie is about some Africans who were enslaved, and they took over a Spanish slave ship and tried to sail back to Africa and were not able to. And instead, the sailors misdirected them to the United States, where there was a trial to see whether these were free men or enslaved men. Now, at the beginning of the movie, you see the Africans in the hold of the slave ship in chains, and you can't understand what they're saying. Now, Spielberg had the option of putting captions, translations on the film, and he chose not to. So you don't understand what the Africans are saying. Their first act is to, one of them slips out of their chains and frees the rest of them, and they end up killing some of the Spanish sailors. So their first act is an act of violence. And the viewer doesn't quite know, what the reason for this. I mean, these could be prisoners, for instance. So this is the way the Africans are pictured. Now, my friend Alex Pate, who's a novelist, was asked to write the novelization of the film script. And when he looked at that opening scene, he went, I can't start the novel there. So where he chooses to start the novel is in Africa. And Cinque is sleeping in his village with his wife and child. He has a family. He has a culture. He has a language. And unlike the movie, you're immediately led into Cinque's thoughts. You're inside his consciousness. He's not inscrutable. He's not untranslatable. And he feels uneasy, and he walks out into the village, and a lion comes into the village, and he kills the lion and saves the village. So you have to ask, why does my friend Alex Pate decide to start the novel there? First off, he starts the novel in Cinque's consciousness. He starts it in a place where Cinque has a family, has a village, has a culture. He's a hero. He uses violence to save his fellow villagers. And more than that, his being Black is not a question at all. It's just not a question. There is no whiteness. He's just a human being. And he doesn't have to go to white people to have them decide whether he was free or enslaved. And if you remember the movie is told mainly through the viewpoint of a young lawyer who is defending these men and his attempts to enlist John Quincy Adams Jr. So it's told entirely from a white perspective. And you don't really get the perspective of the Africans who've been enslaved. And so, in essence, what I feel Alex did is he created an African-American novel, not a white savior movie. And yet he made it from the same film script. And so my book uses the term ontology, and ontology in philosophy is just simply categories of thought. And we don't really realize how words and categories shape how we think about the world. And the definition of what it means to be white in our society and what it means to be Black has, since 1619, been controlled by white people. It's not a set of definitions, a set of rules, a set of beliefs that Black people created or any other people of color. And we don't really realize how deeply embedded those things are until we begin to penetrate beneath the surface. So Spielberg, I think, was trying to make this movie where saying these Africans are equal, but there's a way in which he couldn't picture them outside of the way white people think about Black people.
The whole. I'm so glad that Alex Pate wrote that book, because I'm a firm believer in counter narratives. That as a man of color, when I hear something and I know it's not true, I have a consciousness, I have thoughts, I have beliefs. And if they're contradictory to what white America is portraying, particularly in media, like Amistad, we'll just stick with that. Like the violence that they show at the beginning, but they negate to show the violence that it takes to enslave somebody, taking someone against their will, stripping them from their families, the trauma that's created, none of that's being shown. And so that's why I think it's important that we have the ability to write counter narratives so that both sides of the story can be heard. As a child, when, my mom would, I would argue with my siblings and stuff like that. Before she handed out a punishment, she wanted to hear both sides of the story. She didn't just take one side of the story for face value and then hand out an edict. But that's just the way it's been in this country. It's one story. We must believe that one story. And if there's a counter narrative, unfortunately, in some instances, there's consequences for speaking up against what society has already, told about the history of slavery and Black America and the experience of Blacks in general. So I so appreciate you adding that, because I've seen the movie Amistad and I ordered the book by Mr. Pate because I want to do a comparison analysis now, because I have seen the movie Amistad, and you're right. It portrays the African slaves as savages, as brutes, as violent individuals, but it don't show the part, how they got there in the first place. So,
and it's not just the way shows or books about Blacks have portrayed Blacks. It's sometimes the absence of any discussion. Yeah. A revered member of my family, wrote an American history book back in the 40s or the 50s. And I picked it up a couple of years ago and looked at it, and there was almost no discussion of racism at all. I mean, a total absence of it. Maybe a page. This is a book for high schoolers. So we went for generations and generations of not talking about it.
Yeah.
So that leads to the. Go ahead.
I was going to say, and it is a part of history. It's the it's the foundational root of the wealth, and David speaks about this in the building of wealth in this country was built upon the institution of slavery. I share a lot of times, like if I was to get free labor and free land, if I had the opportunity to have free labor and free land, particularly now as a business owner, I don't have to pay nobody. I get all my services for free. All my associates don't charge. I would be, I would be able to accumulate generational wealth too. So the institution of slavery, it was a wealth building tool that not just the slave masters benefited from, but the American society as a whole. You look at just the cotton industry and what that did for this country in terms of exporting of goods. It just really, we can't ignore it, because it, meaning racism and slavery and all those things that come with it, has been the building blocks and the foundation that this country has stood on for many centuries. And I want to reflect about, in your book, David, you really dissect the life of Thomas Jefferson in this context of racism, slavery, and democracy. And so for me, when I was in high school and middle school, and I read history books, American history books, I didn't see Thomas Jefferson, and it wasn't taught about Thomas Jefferson and the founding fathers in the way that you dissect and share both sides of the story. Reading your book and reflecting back on what I learned about Thomas Jefferson, I only got one side of the story. So can you share a bit about why it's important to share both sides of the story as it relates to shaping the consciousness of Black American and African Americans in this country.
So let's consider the way we have been traditionally taught about Jefferson in our history classes, right? When we're growing up. He's the third president. He wrote the Declaration of Independence. He was fundamental in the forming of the Constitution. He was a brilliant writer. He helped with the revolution. He helped found the country. We owe a great debt to him. He was an amazing man who was an architect. He was an inventor. But then what if I told you this same man enslaved 600 people? What if I told you that he impregnated a 16-year-old girl who was his slave and had children with her? And she was, what's interesting about Sally Hemings is that she was a quarter Black. So their children were 1/8 Black. People would say, Tom sure looks like you. This man kept his own children as slaves. This man kept his own, the mother of his children as slaves. And again, he impregnated a 16-year-old girl. If that man lived down the block, right, we would report him to the police. We would say there's something wrong with this man. There's something psychologically deranged about him. Now, we don't want to look at the second Jefferson, which is also Jefferson. And we don't want to look at what is the perspective of the people he held as slaves. What are their stories? What were their narratives? What was their consciousness? And one of the things recently, I saw this great play, I can't remember the playwright, but a local play about Sally Hemings and her perspective. But here's the other thing. People say, well, that was so long ago. It's like, David, why bring that up? Oh, okay, Jefferson owned slaves, big deal. What difference does it have in the present? Jefferson was a leading ideologist and proponent of slavery during his time. He used the brilliance of his writing, which created the Declaration of Independence, to create anti-Black tracts, which promoted white supremacy. Now people say, okay, he did that. Well, what's the effect? We know that Blacks in America are half as likely to receive pain medication for the same condition as white Americans. And when they receive pain medication, they receive noticeably less pain medication for the same conditions. Now, Linda Villarosa, in her book Under the Skin, which is about racial disparities and health disparities in this country, she cites a 2016 study which asked questions of 222 white medical students. And the study found that half of these white medical students profess some sort of belief that Blacks feel less physical pain than whites. And you can understand how that belief might be a factor in Blacks receiving less pain medication for the same condition. Now, back in the 1700s, Jefferson wrote tracts which said that white people were more intelligent than Black people, morally superior, more culturally superior, spiritually superior, and that Black people were suited for slavery in part because they felt less physical pain than whites. So that idea from the 1700s is in half of these 222 white medical students in 2016. So you cannot tell me that these ideas from the past don't affect the present. Secondly, if you lower the moral bar in the past, like if you don't really deal with the enormous monstrosity of what slavery was and the moral depravity that went into it, it is so much easier to lower the moral bar in the present when you're dealing with racism. And you can't understand the racism that exists in the present without understanding how racism was created in our history. So this is why the telling of history matters. And of course, conservatives know this. They want to ban Moms for Liberty, this Tennessee conservative group, wants to ban the story of Ruby Bridges, who was a 6th 6-year-old black girl who desegregated a New Orleans school in 1960 and walked to school in the face of shouting, jeering, insulting, spitting white adults. And the Moms for Liberty go, oh, this is going to hurt our white children, right? Now, my children who are Japanese American and white read the story Ruby Bridges and they were inspired. They thought, boy, this 6-year-old black girl was incredibly brave. She, it was an example of social justice, of fighting for equality. The Moms for Liberty don't think their white children can be inspired by Ruby Bridges. And that's how you know they're racist. But the other reason why you know it's racist is that they're so worried about their white children hearing this disturbing story about Ruby Bridges. But they're not worried that each black parent in this country, at a certain point, must tell their children stories of police brutality and police murder in order to guide them in their encounters with the police. And so if Moms for Liberty were so concerned about children being disturbed by disturbing narratives, they may try to begin to reduce police brutality and police harassment so black parents wouldn't have to tell their children stories of those narratives.
Let's pick up on this thread. There's a big monument to Jefferson in Washington, and right near it is a big monument to Abraham Lincoln. And you have an essay on Lincoln. And it happened as I was reading that essay, I was finishing John Meacham's book, recent book out on Lincoln. I don't know if you've had a chance to read that or not, but the theme through the book is about racial justice in Lincoln's time. And so could you talk a little bit about your essay, and then maybe we can have a back and forth about Meacham's approach.
Yeah, well, I learned about Lincoln the way, through the early black and white movies about Lincoln. And Lincoln is the creator of the Emancipation Proclamation, as steering America through the Civil War, and as a hero of equality. But when I began as an adult reading about Lincoln, I found that he did have racist views. For instance, a group of black ministers came to the White House, and he told them, the least white man is superior to the best of your race, and you will never become part of America. Now, there are people who argue, well, you can't judge Lincoln by the standards of our time, by the moral racial standards of our time. You have to judge him according to his time. And I understand that. You have to understand the historical perspective of that time and to think about him in that the moral and racial climate at the time. But when people say this, they aren't considering those black ministers as part of the moral climate of the time, because they lived at the same time Lincoln did, and they believed they were equal. So what you're saying what white people are actually saying when they're saying judge Lincoln by the moral climate of his time, they're actually just saying judge him according to the white people of his time. And even that, the British got rid of slavery many decades before America did. Charles Dickens came to America and realized slavery was an abomination. So there were white people who recognized the abomination of slavery. But more than that, you're saying the black ministers, their judgment of Lincoln means nothing to our historical understanding of Lincoln. So you remember there used to be this, blacks couldn't play in the major leagues. They could only play in the black baseball leagues. So you're creating, in a way, your definition of moral climate is it only includes white people. And you're doing that in the present. So you're excising the moral judgments and perspectives of African Americans in 1864, but you're doing that today. And part of what you're unconsciously doing is saying they're not part of America. And then how is that not racist?
One of the takeaways I had from reading Meacham's book, and I read a lot of, American presidential nonfiction books, was he portrayed a flawed character. He realized that the Constitution, as it then sat, was racist, in effect. He built upon the Declaration of Independence, interestingly enough, knowing full well, I'm sure, though this point isn't made, of Jefferson's flaws that you pointed out. But he interpreted that all people are created equal. We find these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, more liberally than the people of that day when Jefferson wrote those words. And he gets across the notion that Lincoln was a politician too, and it's the art of the possible. But in getting to be president, his position was that what you said, and also that Blacks should be given the opportunity and even finance to go back to Africa. That he really believed in separate, but that they needed to be separated. So while he would point out the pluses and the minuses, he pointed out in the book just unbelievably racist things that were going on at the time, and made the point that the progress that was made under Lincoln was almost immediately torpedoed by Johnson, and that led to Jim Crow, the whole Jim Crow era. So we only got to a point and then regressed. And I think, and then putting that in today's perspective, what I'm seeing in some of the laws that are being passed and the trying to cut back on the kinds of things you're talking about that would be good for our country. There's a pushback, a huge pushback, a disturbing, in my mind, pushback, legislatively and otherwise. So we go up and we go down.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and it echoes a point I make in the Stories Whiteness Tells Itself, because after the essay on Lincoln, I talk about Reconstruction in the period after the Civil War, when, as you say, the South worked very hard to create the Jim Crow system of segregation and oppression. And in every era in American history, when there has been legal progress for Blacks towards equality, subsequently, there has been a concentrated effort to fight against that, a backlash against that. So that right after the Civil War, Blacks did have some rights and were able to elect officials and control government. And white people went, oh, no, this is not going to happen. We're not going to let this happen. And the efforts of Reconstruction to establish Jim Crow took place on the level of violence, right? Terror, the KKK, took place on the level of laws like the Black Codes, which stated simply that if a Black person were not literally actually working for a white person, they could be arrested at any time. And not just by the police, by any white person, right? So one of the things that they also did was, they put 100,000 Black people in prison. And once these Black people were in prison, they could be hired out as slave labor. So every era, what the white backlash tries to do is establish the norms of the previous era without actually using the language saying that they're doing so. So when we had the civil rights laws of the 50s and of the 60s, and we began to try to desegregate schools, there are school systems in the South now which are just as segregated. as they were back in the 1960s, right? And we created private schools and charter schools, and we called it by a different name. So as David Blight said, the historian David Blight, who's an historian of Reconstruction, he said, hypocrisy is a tool of racism. And it's been used over and over again. And so now we have a backlash, and the part of the backlash is against the election of Obama.
Sure. And so critical race theory has become a bad word, a dirty word. You know, it's been turned into what does it really mean to something to push back on, that there's a problem with it, being criticized and so forth. Could you talk a little bit about that in today's,
Yes, I mean, first of all, critical race theory, the actual critical race theory, people are not really talking about, because critical race theory is a complex legal theory which examines how racial inequality is built into the law. Now, I'm sure that this is not taught in a high school in Florida. Now, DeSantis, there was somebody wrote a whole book criticizing wokeness. And then when this woman was asked to define wokeness on a television interview, she couldn't even define it. Now, the DeSantis administration has defined wokeness as the belief that there is systemic injustice in America. So if you merely propose that racism is systemic in America, right, or that there is systemic class injustice in America, or systemic discrimination against women or LGBTQ people, you are saying what is anathema to these people. And of course, if you can't examine these systems of injustice, how can you begin to take them apart? If you can't speak about them, how can you take them apart?
Right.
And DeSantis has banned the first version of the African American AP Studies course in Florida. And we never look at it from the perspective of history. When Africans came to this country, white slave owners forbid the Africans to speak their own language. They forbid the Africans to teach their culture and their history. What is DeSantis doing now but saying the African American writers and scholars who created this AP course cannot teach their own culture and history? It is right in the tradition of the white slave owner.
Sure.
And we don't see it.
I've come up, I've read the article in the New York Times around the revamping of the curriculum, the advanced study curriculum, and in your book, and just in my own personal experiences with what I'm calling consciousness canceling. And what I mean by that, so you mentioned, David, that slave owners controlled basically the minds, the bodies, the soul, and the spirits of the slaves, because they were already physically in bondage. They were emotionally and psychologically traumatized when seeing other members of their family being whipped and all these things. And then on top of that, they were not allowed to have any books, couldn't read the Bible, none of those things. And so that's why history is so important to examine, because now the same thing is happening now. There's certain books, there's certain topics that are being, quote unquote, forbidden to be taught to African-American students and kids, and they should know their history. So consciousness canceling is something that I see prevailing in our society, where we don't want, we try to control the consciousness and the thoughts and the thinking and the beliefs of people of color, whether it's based on history or based on what's happening today in our society, because that consciousness, in my opinion, the raising of that consciousness creates the counter narrative that I think white America really doesn't want to be, out there. There's this single-sided story seems to be the one that's been the driving force of success and wealth and all those things in this country. And so I call it consciousness canceling. In your book, you have this term called the psychic Sherpa. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and then tied into this bumper sticker quote that I thought was really telling about keeping the psychology of the past active in the present.
Yes. So the
maybe start with that bumper sticker.
Yeah, the bumper sticker of it, my wife is from Georgia. We were writing, we saw this bumper sticker which said, if I'd known it was this much trouble, I would have picked my own cotton. And obviously the person who wrote that is a racist, and really what they're saying is, I wish that Black people were not part of this country. But they're looking at slavery as simply a system, an economic system. It's a system of economics. It's a system of political oppression. But it was also a system of ideas. We created the category of whiteness and Blackness was actually officially enshrined after Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. It was the first white working class rebellion in America. And the white elites went, oh my God, we cannot let this happen. So what we'll do is we'll tell these working class people, we're never going to let them have the economic advantages that we do, but we're going to tell them you're white and you're superior to Black people. You have these privileges, you have these rights that Black people don't have. And originally, well, I won't go in, it's a very complex thing I want to say about that. But one of the rules about being white was nobody could do violence to you unless you had broken the law or the war was declared. But for Blacks who were enslaved, there was no rules prohibiting violence against the Black body. They didn't need to break a law. They didn't need to declare war. The Black body could be physically threatened and beaten or killed without any justification. Well, look at some of the police videos that we see, of the way Black people are treated by the police. How can you say that idea is still not there in our society? How can you say the Black codes from Reconstruction, which made it essentially criminal to be Black, right? My book starts with Philando Castile, who was an African-American man who was murdered in not more than 3 miles from my house. And he had been arrested, he had been stopped by the police over 50 times in 10 years. His mother says 80 times. There's not a white person in Minnesota who's been stopped that many times over a period of 10 years. In many ways, his he must have felt in part like there's this, the threat of my death is there every time I get into a car. And many African Americans feel that, right? And white people don't want to know about that. They don't want to know about the narratives and consciousness and pain of Black people and people of color, that remember these things that happened in our past. Yes, there are great things that happened in our past, and we should celebrate them. But we should also be able to look at the good and the bad. And we should all be able to look at racial progress and racial regression. And we don't think that, one of the things I talk about whiteness is not, I'm not here to shame or guilt white people. I don't believe you change people through shame or guilt. You change them through love and knowledge. I think Martin Luther King Jr. believed that. But there's a lot of things that people don't know, and people don't know that they don't know. And then the rules of whiteness, and I define whiteness as an ideology, the set of rules, beliefs, practices that establish white supremacy and continue to enforce it. It's beliefs, ideas, practices, rules. And one of the rules is that white knowledge is always true, objective, valid, and official. White knowledge is always valid, true, objective, and official, where Black knowledge is always invalid, subjective, and either false or suspicious, and certainly unofficial, unless white people decree it. And so that, when DeSantis is really saying, even though I'm not an African-American scholar, I'm not an African-American writer, but my knowledge is superior to all these African-American writers and scholars. And I can decree this AP Studies course to be lacking in educational value. That is an enforcement of a rule of whiteness. And it exists on the basis of level of how we value knowledge and narratives. So the narrative of the police, of the white police, is always official, true, valid, objective. The narrative of the Black person harassed by the police is always suspect, invalid, unofficial, right? And that was these rules were established centuries ago.
So I'm the white guy of the three of us, and a lot of our listeners are white. And one of the chapters, one of your essays, so this discussion has been to identify a lot of different factors, but one of your essays is about what to do about it. You call the chapter Abandoning Whiteness. And what I love about it is a step-by-step approach, very practical stuff. Could you walk us through those steps and talk about that?
Yeah. Well, one of the things is, like, my knowledge of race in America is not perfect. I'm going to make mistakes. No one person knows everything about every single group in America. They're all things we don't know. And they're all things we don't know. So in order to address our problems of race, first we must admit there are a lot of things we don't know, and we better start learning them. And you learn them through reading, you learn them through attending events, perhaps with people of races and ethnicities and cultures different than you. You learn by beginning to socialize differently, right? It was a little easier for me to socialize with people of different races because I just kept on meeting artists and writers of different races and engaging in great conversations with them. But then at a certain point, you have to begin to change, like I said, your social life. But the question of how you think of yourself, you need to undergo a sort of spiritual psychological shift. And the way I liken it is, there's a famous book by Helen Kubler-Ross called On Death and Dying. And it's about the process of the way people come to terms with death. And she has this chart, which she calls the 5 stages of grief. And the first stage is denial. So you're denying that you're dead. Then it's anger. It's like, why should I die? Then it's bargaining. Can I have a little more time? Then it's grief. You feel sad. And then at a certain point, you accept you're going to die. Well, at a certain point, in order for America to recover from racism, many of the basics of white identity have to die. And so there's at first there's denial. There's no racism in this society. In fact, white people are more discriminated against now than people of color. Or, there's no racism. There's just a few bad apples. Then it's anger. It's like, why are you bringing this subject up? Our school was perfectly fine. People in our business got along perfectly fine. And still you started bringing up these charges of racism. You're causing all this conflict. The problem is with you. Then it becomes bargaining. Well, there's racism, but isn't it just a few bad apples? It's not really as extensive, as you're maintaining, right? And then it's grief. It's like, oh my God, how did this happen? I feel so, and often white people feel terrible about themselves as being white people. And like, I don't really necessarily think that helps anybody. I don't want white people to sit there and beat their chest and say I'm a horrible person. That serves no one. But I do want you to recognize that there is a system of racism which we all need to work to dismantle. Or they feel like, how do you deal with it? But you just deal with it. People of color deal with it because it's what we have to deal with. And then finally, there's acceptance. And in acceptance, you start spending so much energy trying to deny things that part of you tells yourself are actually true, that there is systemic racism in the society, that we don't understand how it works, and that we have to accept that these racial disparities indicate there is racism in our society. So now let's go about and try to figure out how to dismantle it. And there's a sense of peace that comes over white people when they, and I know this because I grew up thinking like a white person. I grew up thinking like a liberal white person. There was a way in which I didn't think that the issues facing Black Americans, I was sympathetic to them, but I didn't see them as mine. And what I realize now is the causes of all the people in America, they're mine because I am an American.
Wow.
Thanks. That was really good. Yeah, it's a transformation. And it's not, you make the point, it's not easy. And you have to stick with it.
Well, Baldwin said that the question of identity is a question inducing the most profound panic. A terror is primary, it's a nightmare of the mortal fall. So to change your identity, he said, is as scary as death. Right? But he also says, our identity should be a little like the robes of the desert, through which one's nakedness can be felt and sometimes discerned. And he says this belief in one's nakedness is all that gives one the ability to change one's robes. So we have to have humility. Whatever identity we have is not who we are, because underneath we're fallible, mortal human beings. Yeah. And we may need to change our robes for a different set of robes.
Wow.
Well, that was good. We're getting close to the end. Kiva, do you have any final questions for David? I mean,
I just want to thank him for his knowledge, his wisdom, just his approach to the counter narratives and just sharing the two sides of the story. That's what I saw here in this book. And as you were going through those 5 steps, I just was reflecting back to a historic Phil Donahue show that took place back, I think, in the early 80s, where he interviewed Minister Louis Farrakhan, which is a prominent minister in the African-American community. And David, all of those things that you described, the denial, and through that whole process, you could clearly see that in the audience. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the show, I'll send you the link to it, but it's a real powerful testament of what you just said, because that was in the 80s and it still resonates now, just how it's hard to accept something as brutal as, racism and systemic racism, slavery, and how it has transcended this country. And I think that whole concept of cognitive dissonance definitely plays a huge role in just trying to get everybody to say it's time to accept and dismantle. But it takes time. It is a paradigm shift, John, of thinking and really a way of being and living. And so I just really appreciate you coming on and sharing your wealth of knowledge and some, the excerpts from your book. It's a powerful writing that I'm looking forward to continuing to finish it up real soon. So thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. Yeah. And thank you for having the show, which is great to have two people of different races talking about race regularly.
The book, I don't know if we said the title of the book, but you've already described why the title makes sense. The Stories Whiteness Tells Itself, Racial Myths and Your American Narratives, and Our American Narratives, by David Mura. And David, I'm going to ask before we get off, one final question we often ask. You're deep into this subject. You talked about your own transformation. How do you remain hopeful?
One thing, young people are so much more enlightened about the issues of race, about LGBTQ issues, about issues of women, right? And so that makes me very hopeful. And as an example of that, my daughter is just last fall was elected to the Minnesota House of Representatives. And she sponsored an ethnic studies bill, which passed in the Minnesota legislature. So
Awesome.
And one of the reasons why she passed the ethnic studies bill, she said, you know, my dad didn't learn anything about the internment of Japanese Americans when he was growing up in his school. And I didn't learn any either. And she says, I want the next generation to be able to understand the whole of American history.
Great answer.
But yeah, what a way to end an awesome conversation. So thank you, David. Thank you, John. Thank you to our listeners and to our viewers for joining us for another fabulous, courageous conversations here on the Race to Social Justice. If you haven't already done so, please make sure you subscribe to our channels. All of our podcasts are available on all well-known streaming platforms. So whether you want to listen or watch, it's all about just keeping the race and going real strong. And I think we just ran another mile here with our author, David Mura. So thank you all for joining us and have a great day.
The Race to Social Justice podcast is produced, edited, and mixed at The Dream in Austin, Texas. Visit thedreamrecordingstudio.com for more info.